The North Atlantic, March 1942. The ocean is a slab of black liquid granite. The wind is a razor slicing across the waves, carrying the taste of salt and freezing diesel exhaust. This is the hunting ground. This is the great conveyor belt of war. And beneath the surface, the wolves are waiting. Inside the steel tube of U-124, the air is thick. A foul cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic tang of electricity. The commander, Kapitänleutnant Jochen Moore, is a predator at rest. He stands at the periscope, his eyes pressed to the cold rubber eyepiece. He is not a monster. He is a technician, a master of a deadly geometric craft. He sees the world as a series of calculations: target speed, angle on the bow, torpedo runtime. He speaks, his voice low, calm, a ripple in the claustrophobic silence of the control room. The crew moves with a practiced, silent efficiency. They are a single organism, an extension of his will. They have done this dozens of times. It is a job. Through the crosshairs, he sees his target. It is not a battleship. It is not a cruiser bristling with guns. It is a fat, slow, ugly thing. A British merchantman, a freighter named the SS Empire Steel. It is a plodding, wallowing cow of a ship, painted a drab, miserable gray. It is a floating warehouse, and to Moore, it is beautiful, because he knows what is inside its hull. Not guns, not tanks. Food. Thousands of tons of it. Dried milk for British babies. Canned beef for factory workers. Sacks of American flour that could bake 1 million loaves of bread. Every crate in that hold is a unit of energy for the enemy war machine. Every calorie is a bullet aimed at the heart of the Reich. Moore's job is to stop those calories. His job is to starve his enemy into submission. He gives the final orders. The torpedoes, the eels, are fired. They are a whisper leaving the boat, then a faint churning trail in the dark water. The men in the U-boat do not cheer. They wait.
They listen. They count the seconds. This is the part of the job that is not technical. This is the part that is faith. On the bridge of the Empire Steel, the watchman sees the white wake too late. He screams. It is a thin, useless sound, ripped away by the wind. The men below decks, sailors and merchant seamen, boys of 17 and grandfathers of 60, have no idea what is coming. They are drinking tea, reading letters from home, thinking of the dockside pubs in Liverpool. The torpedo strikes with a sound that is not a sound. It is a physical event. A deep, gut-wrenching concussion that rips through the steel plates of the hull, that throws men from their bunks, that turns the engine room into a scalding hell of steam and fire. A second torpedo hits. The ship, this 20,000-ton vessel of steel and rivets, shrieks as its spine is broken. It goes down fast. The lights flicker and die. The angle of the deck becomes a cliff. Sacks of flour burst, mixing with the black bunker oil that pours from the ruptured tanks. The sea is suddenly a thick, greasy soup of spilled grain and dying men. The ship's whistle gives one last, mournful groan as the sea rushes in. Then, silence. The ocean swallows the evidence, leaving only a dark stain on the surface and a few dozen men clinging to pieces of wood in the freezing water. Kapitänleutnant Moore makes a neat entry in his logbook. Another 5,000 tons of enemy supplies sent to the bottom. A good night's work. He gives the order to dive deep. The wolf slips back into the darkness, leaving the silence behind. This is the official doctrine of the German Kriegsmarine. This is Admiral Dönitz' perfect system of strangulation. This is the Battle of the Atlantic. And in the spring of 1942, America and its allies are losing, catastrophically. The established solution, the convoy, is a suicide pact. The losses are unsustainable. A lifeline of food, of fuel, of weapons is being severed, one freighter at a time. This is the story of that battle, but it is not the story of sonar or depth charges or aircraft carriers. It is the story of how the German strategy was defeated by a weapon they could never target, a supply line they could never sink. It is the story of an impossible problem, the slow starvation of a nation, being solved by an unlikely person with no credentials, no rank, and no authority. This is the story of how one woman's simple, radical idea, born in a kitchen, not a war room, would launch the largest, most successful, and most overlooked logistical campaign of the entire war. The story of how the American home front was turned into a farm, and how a backyard garden became a weapon of mass salvation. To understand the garden, you must first understand the crisis. By early 1942, America was a giant, just waking up.
The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered its isolation, plunging it into a two-ocean war it was desperately unprepared to fight. The nation was mobilizing on a scale unprecedented in human history. It was to become, in President Roosevelt's words, the great arsenal of democracy. But an arsenal is more than just bullets and bombs. An army, as Napoleon said, marches on its stomach. So does a factory. So does an entire allied nation. America was not just committed to arming its allies through the Lend-Lease Act, it was committed to feeding them. The problem was Britain. The island nation, standing alone for years against the Nazi war machine, was on the brink of starvation. It imported more than half of its food. Every ton of it had to cross the killing ground of the North Atlantic. Every ship that went down was a bite taken from the mouth of a British child. Lord Woolton, Britain's iron-willed Minister of Food, was sending increasingly desperate reports to Washington. The British ration, already meager, was being cut again and again.
People were living on potatoes, bread, and whatever they could grow in their public parks, which they had already plowed under. The situation was dire. The American solution was, on its face, the most powerful weapon imaginable: the American agricultural system. It was a modern marvel, a behemoth of industrial production. The endless wheat fields of the Great Plains, the vast herds of cattle in Texas, the sprawling orchards of California, all connected by the most extensive rail network on the planet. It was a system run by men who believed in scale, in efficiency, in centralization. The man at the top was Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard. He was a practical Indiana farmer, a man who understood hogs and corn. He was also a top-down bureaucrat who believed, with an almost religious fervor, in the power of big agriculture. His department was an army of statisticians, economists, and agronomists. They saw feeding the nation and its allies as a complex math problem, one that only they, the experts, could solve. Their answer was more. More industrial farms, more mechanization, more government planning. They were confident, almost arrogant, in the power of their system to meet the challenge. But the system, for all its power, was beginning to fail. It was cracking under the immense, unforeseen pressures of total war. The first crack was at sea, the U-boats. It did not matter how much wheat Wickard's farmers grew in Kansas if it ended up as fish food 300 miles south of Iceland. The sheer volume of shipping losses was staggering, a hemorrhage of resources that no amount of production could offset. The German wolf packs were not just sinking ships, they were sinking the entire Allied food strategy. The second crack was on the rails. The United States military had absolute priority. Every train car, every locomotive was being marshaled for the war effort. A freight car carrying oranges from Florida to Chicago was a freight car that could be carrying artillery shells from a factory in Ohio to the port of embarkation in New York. The complex, intricate web of domestic transport that moved food around the nation was being starved of capacity. Fresh produce was rotting in fields in the west, while shelves were growing bare in the east. The third crack was on the farm itself. The system ran on men, machines, and chemicals. All three were now being requisitioned for the war. Millions of farmers and farm laborers were trading their overalls for uniforms. The steel needed to make a new tractor or a simple plow was the same steel needed to make a Sherman tank. The nitrogen used for fertilizer was the same nitrogen used to make TNT. The industrial farm, the foundation of Wickard's whole strategy, was being forced to cannibalize itself to feed the very war machine it was meant to sustain. This was the ticking clock. In the cities, the first signs of strain were appearing. Sugar rationing began in May 1942. Coffee would be next. Housewives were facing shortages and empty butcher's counters for the first time in their lives. Hoarding began. Black markets sprouted. The smooth, effortless abundance of the American grocery store, a cornerstone of the nation's identity, was becoming a memory. The institutional arrogance was the response from Washington. Wickard and his army of experts at the Department of Agriculture saw the problem, but their solution was to double down on their own failing system. They called for patriotic sacrifice. They issued press releases and pamphlets telling housewives how to cook with leftovers. They planned for nationwide rationing of almost all stuffs. They saw the solution as tightening the nation's belt. They saw the problem as one of managing scarcity. The idea of creating abundance from the ground up was alien to them. The idea that millions of ordinary citizens with no expertise could contribute to the food supply was, to their minds, absurd. It was a joke. Amateur gardening was a hobby, a pleasant suburban pastime. It was not a serious tool of national strategy. It was inefficient. It would waste precious seeds, fertilizer, and tools. It was a distraction, a feel-good, sentimental gesture that would have no real impact. They feared it would create a false sense of security, encouraging people to believe they did not need the government's rationing programs. They actively, publicly discouraged it. The system was perfect in its own bureaucratic logic. It was also completely, utterly, and dangerously wrong. It was failing to see the one resource that was not being rationed, that was not being sunk by U-boats, and that was present in almost every community in the nation.
It was not a factory or a farm. It was the American backyard. The system, in its arrogance, had decided that the American people were simply mouths to be fed. It never occurred to them that they could be hands that could do the feeding. This is the story of the woman who would prove them wrong. A woman who had no title, no office in Washington, no seat at the table with the generals and the secretaries. A woman who was about to fight the German U-boat command with a packet of carrot seeds. Her name was Helen Crocker, and she was the last person in America anyone in a position of power would ask for advice on how to win a war. She was not a general, an admiral, or a senator. She was a writer for a women's magazine, a publication filled with recipes, sewing patterns, and advice on raising children. Her office was not in the Pentagon, but in a sunlit room in New York City with floral curtains. Her expertise was not in logistics or ordnance, but in the quiet, domestic calculus of the American home. She was, in the eyes of the men running the war, an expert in trivialities. Helen Crocker was not a square-jawed titan of industry. She was a woman in her 40s, with sensible shoes and an eye for detail. She saw the world not through the grand, abstract lens of strategy, but through the intimate, practical lens of the kitchen. Her desk was not covered in maps of the Atlantic, but in letters, hundreds of them, every week, from every corner of the country. They were from women in Ohio and Texas and California, and they were all starting to ask the same questions. They wrote about the price of sugar, the scarcity of coffee, the strange absence of canned tomatoes on the grocery shelf. They wrote with a quiet, simmering anxiety. They were the wives and mothers of the men being sent to fight. They had been told to be patriotic, to be strong, to keep the home fires burning. But they were beginning to feel a sense of powerlessness, of being small, forgotten cogs in a vast, impersonal war machine. She was, in every meaningful way, an uncredentialed, overlooked, and completely unofficial observer. But Helen Crocker had a qualification that Claude Wickard and his army of statisticians did not. She had a direct line to the emotional and practical reality of the American home front. She did not see the American people as a set of consumption statistics to be managed. She saw them as her readers, as millions of capable, worried, and deeply patriotic individuals desperate to do something more than just knit socks and roll bandages. This was her eureka moment. It was not a single flash of insight. It was a slow-burning realization, fueled by the rising tide of fear in her readers' letters and the increasingly grim headlines from the Atlantic. She looked at the government's response, the calls for sacrifice, the pamphlets on using leftovers, the plans for rationing, and she saw a profound, insulting miscalculation. The government was treating the American people like children, telling them to eat their peas and tighten their belts. They were asking for passive acceptance of scarcity. Helen saw something else. She saw a dormant, untapped resource of incredible power. She looked out her office window at the rooftops of New York. She thought of the suburbs with their manicured lawns. She thought of the small towns with their vacant lots next to the railroad tracks. She thought of the schoolyards, the church grounds, the slivers of earth next to every factory and firehouse in the nation. It was a crazy quilt of millions of acres of fertile, available land. And she remembered. She remembered the last war. She remembered the posters, the slogans, sow the seeds of victory. She remembered her own mother in their small backyard in Pennsylvania, tending a plot of beans and tomatoes. A war garden, an idea that had worked before. An idea that the experts of 1942, with their faith and industrial scale and centralized control, had completely forgotten, or worse, dismissed as a folksy relic of a bygone era. This was her unique observation. The U-boats could sink ships. The railroads could be clogged with tanks. The industrial farms could be drained of men and material. But no German torpedo could touch a backyard in Cleveland. No logistical bottleneck could stop a woman from walking 10 feet from her kitchen to pick a tomato for her family's dinner. The problem was not a shortage of food production. It was a crisis of distribution. Her idea was to bypass the entire vulnerable transcontinental distribution system. It was to create millions of tiny, independent, unsinkable supply lines. It was to turn every American home that had a patch of sun and soil into its own grocery store, its own farm, its own arsenal. She wrote a memo, a passionate, meticulously researched proposal. She called them victory gardens. She detailed how a grassroots program, encouraged by the government, could supplement the national food supply, boost morale, and free up the commercial food pipeline for the troops and allies. She sent it, through a contact of her publisher, to the Department of Agriculture, to Secretary Wickard's office. The response was a disaster. It was worse than being ignored. It was a polite, condescending, and utterly dismissive pat on the head. A junior aide sent back a form letter. It thanked Mrs. Crocker for her patriotic sentiment. It explained that modern agriculture was a highly scientific affair, best left to the professionals. It warned that an amateur gardening program would lead to a terrible waste of valuable resources. Seeds, fertilizer, and tools were all needed for the real farmers who were feeding the troops. The established leadership did not just reject her idea, they found it faintly ridiculous. A woman's magazine editor telling the nation's top agricultural minds how to do their job. It was a joke. Leave the war to the men, madam. Your readers should focus on the recipes we send them. This was the catalyst. The letter, the condescension, the utter blind arrogance of the system. Helen Crocker looked at the letter, and then she looked at the stack of mail on her desk from women who were scared, who felt useless, who wanted to fight back. The experts were wrong. The system was failing. It was protecting its own authority at the expense of the nation's resilience. She was going to break the rules. She made a decision. It was not a decision. It was a declaration of war. A quiet, one-woman war against bureaucratic inertia. If the government would not lead, she would. She would bypass them entirely. She would take her case directly to the people. Her weapon would not be a memo. It would be her column. This was her unauthorized test. This was her new tactic. In the next issue of her magazine, buried among articles on spring fashion and how to mend a tablecloth, she launched a revolution. The article was called "Your Kitchen Garden is a Fortress." It was not a suggestion. It was a call to arms. It was a direct, passionate appeal. She described the U-boats in the Atlantic. She described the British children living on potato rations. She described the train cars loaded with tanks that needed to get to the front. And then she laid out the plan. Her invention was not just the idea of planting a garden. It was a complete, brilliantly simple, open-source system for turning any American into a small-scale farmer. She did not just say, plant vegetables. She told them how. The magazine published detailed blueprints, how to build a raised bed, how to double-dig a plot of heavy clay soil. It had charts showing which vegetables grew best in which climate zones. It had designs for small, simple cold frames to extend the growing season. It was a masterclass in decentralized logistics. She anticipated the shortages the government had warned about. No fertilizer? She published a guide on how to create a compost pile from kitchen scraps, turning garbage into black gold. No pesticides? She included instructions on companion planting, using marigolds to deter nematodes, planting nasturtiums to draw aphids away from beans. She ran articles on how to save seeds from one year to the next, creating a self-sustaining supply that required no government input. She turned her magazine into a national strategy guide. The most radical part of the plan was not the gardening, it was the preservation. She knew that 1 million fresh tomatoes in August would be useless by February, so she launched a parallel campaign. She declared war on the garbage can. She turned canning and preserving, once a grandmotherly chore, into a patriotic duty. The magazine ran detailed illustrated guides on water bath canning, on pressure canning for low-acid vegetables, on drying and pickling. The kitchen, she wrote, was no longer just a place to cook dinner. It was a food factory. Every jar of green beans put up on a shelf was a bullet fired at the axis. The "it works" moment was not a single event. It was a flood. The magazine hit the newsstands, and a switch was thrown. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and chaotic. It was the very thing the tidy-minded bureaucrats in Washington had feared. It was a nationwide, uncoordinated, and wildly enthusiastic explosion of amateur farming. Her office was deluged. Letters poured in, not with questions, but with reports from the field. A group of shipyard workers in Maine had commandeered a vacant lot and were planting potatoes. A church congregation in Alabama had plowed up the lawn around their chapel and planted it with collard greens. The firemen of a station in San Diego had built planter boxes on their roof and were growing lettuce. The idea went viral. It leaped from the pages of the magazine into the national consciousness. Other magazines picked it up. Newspapers started running gardening columns. Radio shows began broadcasting planting advice. It was a grassroots movement that needed no leader, no central command. It was fueled by a simple, powerful idea, unleashed at exactly the right time. The first green shoots were the proof. In backyards and schoolyards across the nation, a quiet green rebellion was taking root. It was tangible. You could see it. You could touch it. You could, in a few short months, eat it. This was a success that could not be denied. It was a success that was growing, quite literally, in the government's own backyard. Secretary Wickard and his experts had warned that it was a foolish waste of resources. But the American people, armed with little more than a magazine article and a spade, were proving them wrong. The test was a success. The unauthorized, stupid idea was genius. And it was about to become so big, so undeniably successful, that the very system that had scorned it would have no choice but to try and take it over. The news of the Green Rebellion did not arrive in Secretary Claude Wickard's office as a triumph. It arrived as a problem. It came in the form of frantic reports from seed companies, their inventories suddenly stripped bare by a tidal wave of amateur buyers. It came as newspaper clippings from 100 cities, showing mayors in shirt sleeves turning the first spade of dirt in a public park. It came as a memorandum from his own statisticians, noting the alarming circulation numbers of certain women's magazines. This was not a movement he had authorized. It was not a program his department had designed. It was chaos. It was anarchy. It was a populist wildfire, ignited by a magazine writer, spreading completely outside the firewalls of his control. This was the system. This was the boardroom. The boardroom in this case was the vast marble-held headquarters of the United States Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., a place of quiet corridors, of thick carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps, of men in dark suits who spoke in the hushed, confident tones of experts. They were the high priests of American food, the keepers of the sacred texts of crop yields and commodity futures. And Claude Wickard was their chief. He looked at the reports with a growing sense of professional fury. He did not see patriotism. He saw waste. He saw bags of precious, scientifically developed fertilizer being dumped on tiny, shaded plots where nothing would grow. He saw valuable seeds, each one a potential unit of food for a soldier, being planted too early or too deep by people who thought farming was a matter of sentiment. He saw a nation of well-meaning but dangerously ignorant citizens about to create a million tiny agricultural disasters in their own backyards. This was the institutional arrogance, the doctrine of the expert, made manifest. He was not a villain. In his own mind, he was a guardian. He was protecting the most powerful weapon America possessed, its industrial food machine, from the well-intentioned sabotage of amateurs. This woman, this Helen Crocker, was not a hero. She was a menace. She was telling people they could win the war with a hoe and a packet of seeds, a romantic, dangerous fiction. She was, he fumed to an aide, encouraging a cult of the amateur. The system began to fight back. Wickard could not simply ban gardening. The political optics would be a catastrophe. Instead, he would strangle the movement with caution. He would kill it with kindness. He launched a counter-offensive of official expert advice. The Department of Agriculture issued a series of press releases. They were masterpieces of bureaucratic condescension. They spoke of the importance of the American farmer, with a capital F. They praised the patriotic spirit of the home gardener, but warned, in grave tones, of the complexities of modern agriculture. They published pamphlets filled with technical jargon about soil pH and nitrogen to potassium ratios, designed not to help, but to intimidate. The subtext was clear. This is harder than you think. You will probably fail. You are wasting resources. Leave this to the professionals who are winning the war. This was the skeptical general, the rival officer, dismissing the new tactic as foolish and inefficient. Wickard and his department were certain they were right. They had the data. They had the science. They had the full, massive power of the American agricultural industry on their side. They saw Crocker's grassroots rebellion as a sentimental distraction that would soon wither and die from its own incompetence. They would not need to crush it. They would simply let it fail, and then they would be there to say, "We told you so," and to restore order. Helen Crocker in her sunlit New York office read the government's press releases, and she understood. She was not just in a battle of ideas. She was in a fight for survival. The system was trying to reassert its control. Wickard's campaign of discouragement was subtle, but it was working. She saw it in the letters that started to trickle in. Readers were now asking for permission. They were worried. A man from the county extension office, a government agent, had told them their soil was no good. A radio program, sponsored by a large commercial cannery, had talked about the dangers of botulism from improper home canning. The system was planting seeds of doubt, of fear. She looked at the stacks of other letters, the ones with photographs tucked inside. A family in Illinois, beaming, holding up impossibly large zucchini. A row of children in a Detroit schoolyard, proudly watering their rows of carrots. This was not a failure. This was the single most hopeful, most vibrant, most successful domestic initiative of the war, and it was in danger of being smothered in its cradle by the very men who should have been championing it. This was the gamble. This was her damn the reals decision. Polite persuasion had failed. The direct appeal to the people had worked, but it was now meeting the full inertial force of the federal government. She could not win a war of press releases against the Secretary of Agriculture. She had to bypass him. She had to go over his head. She had to find a more powerful advocate, an ally the system could not dismiss, intimidate, or ignore. Her decision was audacious. It was a political longshot, a move that could end her career and discredit her entire movement. She was going to try to reach the White House. She began to assemble a weapon. It was not a memo, it was a portfolio, a thick, heavy scrapbook filled with the proof of her success. She gathered the best letters, the ones that spoke of renewed hope and community spirit. She included the photographs of the shipyard workers, the firemen, the schoolchildren. She compiled statistics from garden clubs and community groups, creating a rough but powerful estimate of the sheer tonnage of food being produced. She was building a case, not for a government program, but for a popular revolution that was already succeeding. It was a dossier that told a story not of wasted seeds, but of a nation's untapped strength. Getting it to the right hands was the next challenge. She was a magazine writer. She had no connections in Washington's halls of power. But her publisher did. He was a man who understood influence. He was initially skeptical, afraid of antagonizing the administration during wartime. But Helen was relentless. She did not just persuade him, she inspired him. She made him see that this was not a political issue. It was a story. The best story of the war. A series of phone calls were made, favors were called in, and the portfolio began a journey, hand to hand, through the corridors of power, bypassing the Department of Agriculture entirely. It was aimed at a single desk, the desk of the one person in Washington who had the president's ear, a known affinity for grassroots movements, and a healthy skepticism for the pronouncements of official, male-dominated bureaucracy. It was aimed at the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. The portfolio landed on her desk not as a piece of official correspondence, but as a curiosity. She saw the photographs first, the faces of the people, the dirt under their fingernails, the genuine, unstaged pride. She was a woman who traveled the country constantly, who had a better feel for the mood of the American people than almost anyone in her husband's government. And in that scrapbook, she saw the physical manifestation of the very spirit she was trying to nurture. It was resilience. It was community. It was a quiet, powerful, and deeply practical form of defiance. She read Helen Crocker's articles, she read the letters, and she understood, with a clarity that had completely eluded Claude Wickard, what this was really about. It was not just about food. It was about morale. It was about giving millions of people, far from any battlefield, a tangible, meaningful stake in the fight. It was about giving a housewife in Kansas a way to fight the U-boats. The men in the Department of Agriculture saw a million inefficient little farms. Eleanor Roosevelt saw a million tiny fortresses of hope. The conflict was now set. On one side, the Secretary of Agriculture, the expert, with his entire bureaucracy, convinced that this was a dangerous and foolish idea. On the other, the First Lady, the advocate, armed with a scrapbook and an intuitive understanding of the American soul. Eleanor made her decision. She would not intervene quietly. She would not make a phone call to Wickard and ask him to reconsider. That was the old way. That was the system's way. She would embrace Helen Crocker's tactic. She would bypass the system and make her case directly to the American people. And she would do it from the most visible, most symbolic piece of ground in the entire country. This was the ultimate gamble, the ultimate damn the rules play. She made an announcement. It was simple, direct, and it landed like a bombshell in the offices of the Department of Agriculture. She had decided, she said, that it was her patriotic duty to help with the food supply. Therefore, she was instructing the White House groundskeepers to plow up a section of the South Lawn. She was going to plant a garden. A victory garden at the White House. The symbolism was devastating. It was a public, presidential-level endorsement of the very movement the Department of Agriculture had been trying to discreetly kill. It was not a suggestion. It was a command performance. The skeptical general was not just overruled, he was about to be publicly contradicted by his own commander-in-chief's wife. The news raced across the country. If a garden was important enough for the First Lady on the lawn of the White House, then it was important enough for everyone. The debate was over. The doubt that Wickard's office had so carefully sown was uprooted in a single news cycle. Claude Wickard was cornered. He and his experts had been outmaneuvered, not by a rival department, but by a magazine writer and the First Lady. His policy of managed discouragement was now in ruins. He could continue to resist, to obstruct, and be seen as an unpatriotic, bureaucratic fool standing in the way of a popular movement now blessed by the White House. Or he could do the only thing a skilled politician can do when he is beaten. He could get in front of the parade and pretend he was leading it. The boardroom conflict was over. The gamble had paid off beyond Helen Crocker's wildest dreams. Her unauthorized test, born in a magazine column, was about to become the official, sanctioned policy of the United States government. The system had not just been fought, it had been conquered. Now it would be co-opted, transformed from the movement's greatest enemy into its most powerful, if reluctant, ally. The quiet Green Rebellion was about to go mainstream on a scale that would dwarf even Helen's original vision. The full, immense power of the federal government was about to be unleashed, not to suppress the idea, but to amplify it into a nationwide call to arms. The kitchen garden was on its way to the front lines. The spring of 1943 was the breaking point. The news from the Atlantic was a steady drumbeat of disaster. The wolf packs were feasting. The official food system, the one Claude Wickard had so fiercely protected, was showing the deep structural cracks of a machine being run past its limits. Rationing was no longer a patriotic game of collecting stamps. It was a grim daily reality. Red points for meat, blue points for canned goods. The American dinner table, once a symbol of boundless plenty, was becoming a landscape of careful calculation and frequent absence. The government's own projections were bleak. The complex web of transport, processing, and distribution was stretched to transparency. A single, prolonged railroad strike, a bad harvest in the Midwest, a successful new German torpedo design. Any of these could trigger a catastrophic collapse. This was the arrogant advance, not of an army, but of a mathematical certainty. The system, the expert system, was beginning to starve itself. This was the moment the quiet Green Rebellion, blessed by the First Lady and now grudgingly embraced by the bureaucracy, met the full force of the national crisis. And the result was not a quiet contribution, it was an explosion. A nationwide, continental-scale eruption of earth-turning, seed planting, and food growing that remains the largest collective agricultural effort in human history. This was the new tactic in action. This was the full cinematic scene. It did not happen in a single place. It happened everywhere, all at once. It was a million small fronts in a single massive war. In Chicago, the manicured lawns of Lincoln Park, the ones that bordered the glittering sweep of Lake Michigan, disappeared. In their place, a vast 200-acre grid of potato rows and bean trellises, tended by office workers on their lunch breaks and families on Sundays. The Illinois Central Railroad turned over thousands of miles of its rights-of-way, the long, fertile strips of land alongside the tracks, and sectioned them off into garden plots for its employees. The trains that once carried food into the city now rumbled past the very food that was replacing it. In the shadow of the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, where the air was thick with the gray grit of production, a new color appeared: green. Shift workers, their faces still smudged with the grime of the blast furnace, came home and knelt in the dirt. They were men and women forging the steel for battleships and tanks, and in their spare hours, they were forging a new kind of weapon, coaxing tomatoes and peppers from soil that had known only industry. In San Francisco, the city tore up the prize-winning flower beds in front of City Hall and planted cabbage. The inmates of Alcatraz, the nation's most notorious federal prison, cultivated a massive vegetable garden on the Rock, its produce feeding the entire prison population and the families of the guards. In Hollywood, the dream factory, the fantasy became reality. Movie stars, who were the closest thing America had to royalty, were photographed for the newsreels, not in gowns, but in overalls. James Cagney, the screen's toughest gangster, was shown proudly displaying a basket of his own tomatoes. Rita Hayworth posed, smiling, with a rake. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also true. The backlots of the movie studios, the spaces between the sound stages, were now filled with neat, productive rows of vegetables. This was a war fought by children. The Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the 4-H clubs. They were mobilized into a green army. They took over schoolyards, turning baseball diamonds into squash patches. They ran neighborhood campaigns to collect kitchen scraps for compost piles. Tiny, uniformed soldiers in the war against waste. They were not just playing, they were working. They were producing a significant, measurable tonnage of food. It was a war fought in the most impossible of places. In New York City, where Earth was a rumor beneath a universe of concrete, gardens bloomed on rooftops, in window boxes, in fire escapes. A single tomato plant growing in a coffee can on a tenement ledge became an act of defiance. The green shoots, reaching for the sun between the canyons of brick and steel, were a silent, living refutation of the enemy's strategy. The enemy. In his concrete bunker in Lorient, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, looked at his maps. He saw a masterpiece of logistical strangulation. His charts showed the tonnage sunk, and the numbers were staggering. He was winning. His wolf packs were severing the artery across the Atlantic. Allied shipping was in a state of crisis. The intelligence reports from Britain confirmed it. Their rations were at near starvation levels. America, his analysts told him, would soon feel the same pinch, its own vast domestic needs overwhelming its ability to supply its allies. His system was perfect. It was a clean mathematical process of attrition. But a new, baffling set of data points began to appear in the intelligence summaries.
Whispers, rumors from neutral diplomats, mentions in American magazines, stray radio broadcasts. The numbers were not adding up. He was sinking the ships, he was destroying the cargo, he was winning the Battle of the Atlantic, but somehow he was not winning the war of food. The enemy's system was supposed to collapse. It was bending, it was groaning, but it was not breaking. He had planned for every contingency, calculated every variable of industrial production and maritime transport. He had aimed his torpedoes at the enemy's stomach, but he had missed the real target because he could not conceive of it. The target was not a convoy, it was 20 million backyards. His perfect system was being dismantled, calorie by calorie, by an invisible, unsinkable, and utterly baffling enemy. An enemy his torpedoes could not find, his spies could not measure, and his strategists could not comprehend. In Washington, Claude Wickard was experiencing his own form of bafflement. He was no longer the enemy of the movement. He had been forced to become its leader. His Department of Agriculture, the same institution that had warned of the dangers of amateurism, was now the biggest publisher of gardening advice in the world. The pamphlets he had once used to intimidate were now brightly colored, simplified, and printed by the millions. They showed smiling families holding up perfect vegetables. They had catchy slogans: "Plant for victory," "Food is a weapon," "Don't let it be a dud in your garden." His entire bureaucracy had been turned on its head. He was now in charge of the very cult of the amateur he had once despised. He sat in his quiet office, the same room where he had dismissed Helen Crocker's idea as a joke, and he looked at the numbers. The numbers were the proof, the validation. They came from his own county extension agents, the men he had sent out to sow doubt, who were now tasked with counting the harvest. The numbers were a military secret, but they were the single most decisive statistic of the home front war. By the end of 1943, there were an estimated 18 million victory gardens in the United States. In 1944, that number would climb to over 20 million, one for every 2 families in the country. And the yield was the number that broke the logic of the expert system. These amateurs, these children and factory workers and movie stars were not failing. They were succeeding on a scale that defied all professional prediction. In 1944 alone, these small, private, inefficient gardens would produce more than 8 million tons of food. It was a figure so large it was abstract. Wickard, the farmer, translated it into reality. 8 million tons. It was 40%. 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the entire United States that year. The tactic was proven decisively in a battle of pure logistics. The system had not just been supplemented, it had been saved. The ripple effect was staggering. Every pound of tomatoes grown in a backyard in Ohio was a pound of commercially grown tomatoes that did not have to be shipped across the country, freeing up a space on a train for a crate of ammunition. It was a pound of canned tomatoes that did not need to be bought at the grocery store, leaving that can on the shelf for a worker who lived in an apartment with no access to land. It was a pound of food that did not need to be processed in a factory, using steel and electricity needed for the war. The pressure on the national food system was released. The crisis was averted. The victory gardens had created a vast parallel food supply, a strategic reserve of nutrition that was completely decentralized, totally resilient, and immune to the enemy's primary weapon. The greatest, most overlooked front of the Second World War was not a beachhead or a battlefield, it was the American backyard. And the final, undeniable proof came not in the form of a medal or a monument, but in the quiet, profound hiss of a million pressure canners in a million kitchens on a hot August night. It was the sound of a nation feeding itself. It was the sound of a victory that had been grown, from the ground up, by the very people the experts had been so sure were the problem. The stupid idea had not just worked, it had become the margin of survival. In the rubble of Flensburg, Germany, in the final chaotic days of the Reich, Allied intelligence officers found the ledgers. They were the meticulous, secret records of the U-boat command, the final accounting of Admiral Donitz's war. And on paper, they told a story of devastating, undeniable victory. The numbers were precise, clinical, and astronomical. The tonnage of Allied shipping sent to the bottom of the Atlantic was a figure that should have guaranteed the collapse of Great Britain and crippled the American war effort. The mathematical logic of the campaign was flawless. The analysts, the men who believed in numbers, looked at the columns of sunken tonnage and then at the columns of Allied war production, and they could not make the equation balance. They had won, and yet they had lost. This was the enemy's baffled after-action report. Dönitz, even in defeat, could not fully comprehend the failure of his perfect system. He had fought a war against a physical supply chain. He had targeted the ships, the ports, the railheads. He saw the enemy as a great industrial organism with a single vulnerable throat, the Atlantic sea lanes. He had spent 5 years trying to strangle it. But his strategy was predicated on a fundamental, fatal miscalculation. He assumed the enemy's food supply was a centralized industrial product that had to ship. He never once considered that it could be grown in 10 million places at once. His U-boats, the most sophisticated naval weapon of their time, were designed to sink freighters. They were useless against a row of beans in a backyard in Dayton, Ohio. The Victory Garden was a weapon that was everywhere and nowhere. It was a logistical miracle hidden in plain sight, a strategic reserve that never appeared on any shipping manifest, never entered any harbor, and never once showed up in the periscope of a U-boat. Donitz's perfect system had been defeated by a tactic so simple, so civilian, and so profoundly American that it was, to the rigid military mind, literally invisible. He had won the battle of tonnage, he had lost the war of calories. And what of the architect of this invisible victory? What of the woman whose quiet, unauthorized idea had done more to blunt the force of the U-boat campaign than a dozen destroyer escorts? Helen Crocker did not receive a medal. There was no parade for the woman who had armed the nation with a spade. There were no monuments erected to the kitchen garden. The war ended. The ships came home. The factories that had built bombers went back to building automobiles. And the Victory Gardens, the 20 million tiny fortresses of hope, were quietly, methodically erased from the American landscape. The lawns were reseeded. The public parks were restored to their floral ornamental glory. The urgent wartime logic of self-sufficiency was replaced almost overnight by the seductive peacetime logic of convenience. The supermarket, with its gleaming aisles and pyramids of canned goods, became the new symbol of American strength. The industrial food system, the very machine whose catastrophic failure the gardens had averted, roared back to life, bigger, more efficient, and more powerful than ever before. It did not just recover, it conquered. And in its conquest, it buried the memory of the grassroots rebellion that had saved it. Helen Crocker went back to her office. She went back to writing her column. She wrote about new cake recipes, about spring cleaning, about the challenges of raising teenagers in the atomic age. She returned to the world of domestic trivia that the men in power had always believed was her proper place. She had been the general of a Green Army, the commander of the largest mobilization of civilians in the nation's history. She had seen a crisis, defied the experts, and provided the solution. And then, when the crisis was over, she simply went back to her desk. She was a woman who had, for a brief, crucial moment, helped feed the free world, and her reward was to be forgotten. Her victory was so complete, so integrated into the fabric of the home front, that it became invisible, like the air itself. It was simply the food that was on the table, the absence of a hunger that never came. The moral. What is the lesson buried in the soil of those forgotten gardens? It is a lesson that every generation, in its arrogance, must learn again. The lesson is that the expert is often the last person to see the truth. The system is blind. The men in Washington, the statisticians and the agronomists, saw the American people as a liability. They were a problem to be managed. They were 20 million mouths that had to be fed, a drain on a fragile system. Their doctrine was one of control, of rationing, of managing scarcity from the top down. It was a doctrine of condescension. It assumed the people were helpless, ignorant, and best led by their betters. Helen Crocker saw the truth. She saw the American people not as a liability, but as the nation's greatest untapped asset. She saw 20 million pairs of hands waiting for a tool. She saw 20 million patches of earth waiting for a seed. Her doctrine was not one of control, but of trust. She did not seek to manage the people. She sought to unleash them. The established system, with all its power and data, was built on a lie. The lie was that strength is a function of scale, of centralization, of professional expertise. The Victory Garden movement proved that true resilience, the kind that can withstand the shock of a world at war, comes from the opposite. It comes from the small, the local, the decentralized. It comes from the community. It comes from the amateur. It proved that in a time of crisis, a nation's security is not measured by the number of its tanks, but by the number of its gardens. It is the simple, profound, and endlessly disruptive idea that the person on the ground, in the kitchen, in the backyard, often understands the reality of a problem far better than the expert in his distant office. The German U-boat was a triumph of engineering. The American response was a triumph of common sense. And common sense, when mobilized on a national scale, is a weapon for which there is no defense. This is the full circle. The unauthorized idea, the stupid kitchen garden that the experts scorned, was not just forgotten. Its lesson was inverted. For the next 70 years, the American food system raced in the opposite direction. It became more centralized, more industrialized, more dependent on complex, fragile, long-distance supply chains than Claude Wickard could ever have dreamed. The backyard garden became a hobby, a quaint piece of nostalgia. The supermarket became the sole source of the nation's sustenance.
The system became powerful, efficient, and fantastically brittle. And then the world changed again. New crises emerged. New U-boats, in the form of climate change, of pandemics, of political instability, began to haunt the new global supply chains. The price of fuel, the fragility of a single container ship stuck in a canal, the reality of a viral outbreak, all revealed the deep structural vulnerabilities of the very system that had promised endless abundance. And the unauthorized idea began to grow again. It is growing today. It is growing in the vacant lots of Detroit, where community gardens are turning food deserts into oases. It is growing on the rooftops of Brooklyn, where urban farms are supplying restaurants and feeding neighborhoods. It is growing in the schoolyards of California, where children are learning, once again, that food does not come from a factory, but from the earth. This is the new doctrine. It is called food security. It is called community resilience. It is called the local food movement. And it is the exact same idea that Helen Crocker championed from her desk in 1942. The unauthorized idea of the magazine writer has become the new standard and official gospel of urban planners, of sustainability experts, of national security strategists. They now know what Helen Crocker knew then, that a nation that cannot feed itself from its own soil is not a secure nation. The quiet green rebellion is happening again. It is a new generation fighting a different kind of war, rediscovering the old, simple, powerful truth. The truth that the strength of a nation is not something that can be built in a factory or decreed from a capital city. It is something that must be grown from the ground up, one backyard, one community, one garden at a time. The battle for the Atlantic was not won by admirals or by generals. It was won by gardeners. And their quiet, overlooked victory is a lesson that is, today, more urgent and more necessary than ever before. The kitchen garden is still a fortress, and the seeds of victory are still waiting in our own hands.